Hello, Mindanao Coast. It is Friday, January the 12th, and it is MLK weekend. It's been a chilly one here on our coast today in the mid-30s. We do have a storm front coming in this Saturday, lots of rain coming in. We have a great guest lined up for you today on this morning show, and he is coming to us via Zoom and YouTube from Colorado, a neuroscientist and author, Dr. Stephen Peters. We're going to be talking to him in just a moment. I've got a couple of announcements for you first. I'm Leanne Lindsay, your host today. I'm a film and voice producer here in the Sea Ranch, a host here for a long time at KGUA, a volunteer, as well as a technician here and wearer of many hats. I am also a horsewoman, and so is Dr. Peters. So we're going to be talking horses today. First, though, we do have these announcements real quick. It's a big artist weekend. We've got Moments in Time, an exhibit by artist Diane Rasmussen, who will open at the Elaine Jacobs Center here in Wallala, and that is going to be 1 to 3 p.m. today. And then on from 4 to 6 p.m. at the Wallala Art Center, it's a big opening for the January exhibit with several watercolor artists. And again, that's 4 to 6 p.m. at the Wallala Art Center. In the Sea Ranch, we've got the Shindig Social Club with local duo Carl Young and Tim Muller on guitar. Food will be available as well. That starts 5:30 to 8:30. Then we have the Wallala Arts Global Harmony Series. That's Saturday, 4 p.m. Folk music with an accent. It's a concert by Men of Worth, and that's going to be at 4 p.m. Tickets are at the Wallala Art Center or Dolphin Gallery on 4 p.m. on Sunday at the Wallala Art Center. It is Chamber Music Series and 4 p.m., so don't forget that one. And lastly, on Monday, it's a great music film night up in Point Arena. Carlos, meaning Santana, a music industry legend for 50 years and a 10-time Grammy-winning global sensation, is going to be portrayed there at the Arena Theater starting 7 p.m. And that will do it for today's announcements. And I'm going to introduce to you now our guest for today, Dr. Stephen Peters is a longtime horseman and a retired neuroscientist from Colorado who specializes in brain functioning. He's the author of Evidence-Based Horsemanship, a book which he co-authored with Martinblack, a fifth-generation cowboy who's worked with thousands of horses and is the son-in-law of renowned horseman Ray Hunt, who was one of the first horse trainers responsible for teaching others that there's a better way to train and work with horses. And over the decades, that way of teaching has become known as natural horsemanship, among other things, which others on my show have referenced many times. And Ray was one of the first people to hold horse handling clinics long before they were called clinics. And Dr. Peters just participated in a clinic this last fall with renowned horseman and author Mark Rashid, who's from Estes Park, Colorado. And his philosophy involves understanding the horse's point of view and solving difficult problems with communication rather than force. In fact, that's where I met Dr. Peters and Mark Rashid, because in Central California at this clinic that they were doing together with Jim Masterson, who also does the Masterson philosophy, the Masterson method with the work of body work, and we can talk about that later. But I met them there because they are participating in the documentary on which I've been working for a while now, called Seabiscuit's Legacy, and we wanted to portray in part how trainer Tom Smith came on the scene and handled Seabiscuit so that he transformed from underdog to champion, just like the children do today when they are treated with care and respect in a horse-assisted therapy program at the home of Seabiscuit, Ridgewood Ranch, located right here in Mendocino County. For now, we're going to dive deep into the evidence behind behaviors and responses between horses and humans. So good morning and welcome to the morning show, Dr. Steve.
Hi there, Leanne. I'm pleased to be a part of your your talk, and it's good to see you again. I sure enjoyed working on that Seabiscuit film, and hopefully your listeners will get a chance to see that here somewhere down the road soon.
Could we just hold on 1 second? We need to just start over again because our automation system was going in the background playing over what you just said. So it's gone now. So good morning.
Hi there, Leanne.
So how are you doing? And you are talking to us from which part of Colorado again?
Ancus, Colorado. It's down in the Four Corners. So we're pretty, if I climb on the ridges of my mountains, I can look off and see the mountains in New Mexico.
Oh,
So
wow.
we're down, I'm about 7 hours from Denver.
Not far from Durango, I would imagine.
Durango's just up the road.
Hey, I love Durango. Been skiing there before.
Oh, it's a great town.
Yeah, I grew up pretty much in Aspen from the 60s to the 80s. So I love Colorado. My sister still lives in Snowmass Village.
Well, if you're missing the snow, we got plenty here. I can send you some.
I'm headed actually to the snow in Park City next week, going to
Ah,
the Sundance Film Festival. I'm so excited.
that's a crazy event. So have fun.
I know. Well, let's talk first about the term evidence-based that's in the title of your book. Just to get
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. My specialty was brain functioning and assessing brain functioning. So as a clinical neuroscientist, so I saw people, and but I've always had horses. But what struck me was that in medicine, you really can't do anything unless it's evidence-based. You have to have proof that what you're doing is actually going to create an event. So you need the research behind what you do. I can't just show up for work and decide, well, let's take a couple of pictures of the guy's head sideways instead of this way or whatever. So,
and by picture, you're talking about.
MRI, neuroimaging. Thanks for bringing that up. I guess we get a little jaded when, and you had said I'm retired. I think I'm busier than I've ever been. I retired from work in the hospital, but I'm traveling all over the place, doing horse brain seminars and I do horse brain dissections as well for audiences. And I think it's pretty fascinating to get a look under the hood and see that structure that commands everything and perceives everything and learns everything. But going back to your original question.
Oh, before we
evidence-based.
Before you do,
yeah.
Speaking of that, I was just listening to the Warwick Schiller podcast, Journey On, with you in that one segment, and he had mentioned retired, but you definitely are not. And I mean, as far as you've got other projects and things you're working on, are you still the director of the Intermountain Healthcare Center for Brain Health?
No, I'm retired, and so basically, in my past, I was the founder and clinical director of the American Fork Hospital's memory clinic. And then I designed another clinic because I was largely seeing individuals who were starting to develop a dementia. And so that would be what I'd be diagnosing. But a deep dive into the research of preventive medicine, diet, exercise, et cetera. I opened another clinic at Utah Valley Hospital, clinic for brain health.
Right.
And so once I retired, I left those two institutions. So it was strictly horses after that.
And we all love horses. I mean, I love my horse, Jax, my black and white paint. I need to go.
But evidence-based is based on scientific studies. It's based on peer-reviewed journal articles, and so that you have a gold standard to hang your hat on. I mean, I used to ask people, well, why do you think your horse does this? And they would say, well, I don't know, they're a left brain introverted Sagittarius. I got all these DVDs, and you would just think, is nothing in the horse world evidence-based? And I don't mean to be so critical, but for me, I struggled with the explanations because I understood brains and I understood horse brains. So that led me to my connection with Martin, because, you know, if I rode every neighbor's horse and every horse I get my hands on, which I did, plus my 7 of my own, that doesn't generalize out into the whole population of horses. So I need to say anything in science, you need big numbers. So I needed somebody who had lots of horses, you know, and I didn't have 150 horses in my backyard. So I found somebody who did, Martinblack, as you had mentioned earlier. So Martin is a 5th generation cowboy. He started race horses, $1 million horses, Mustangs. He doesn't do them any differently. They're all horses. They all have brains. And so I went out with Martin, and he had all the empirical data. In other words, he had years of observation. And as you had mentioned, you know, he was Ray Hunt's son-in-law, and he ran this large ranch, the Wine Cup Ranch, and there's over 1 million acres. So he had lots of cowboys under him and lots of horses. So he invited his friend, this little diminutive guy, to come up and help work with the horses. And that guy's name was Tom Dorrance, who's also a name in the beginnings of this natural horsemanship. So Martin and I don't call this natural horsemanship. That's kind of gotten, you know, watered down, and people have taken it down all kinds of different avenues.
I'm glad you're expressing that, because that's a question I had.
Yeah. So I don't know that there's any, if you ask somebody, I'm not quite sure what that means. And even people who practice something along those lines have divorced themselves from that title. People think it's just, you know, you put your horse in the round pen and you get yourself a carrot stick and you chase them around 1,000 times. And then when they stop, they come to you, and that's natural horsemanship. But what Martin and I did is we would go out together and look at horses. And we had this woman, Kim Stone, who's a buckaroo and a photographer. So her work has shown up in Western Horsemen and in galleries. She's really talented. She would just take thousands of images. At night, Martin and I would go over them all, and I'd say, do you see how that, you know, facial nerve causes these ligaments to tighten up in the jaw when the horse is in this particular state? And Martin said, how do you know that? I said, well, I know how brains work. And he said, it took me like 1,000 horses before I started to look at those things. So it was like 2 kids with different pieces of the puzzle. So we just laid them out, and it was fascinating to both of us. And it was Martin who eventually said, you know, because this was only an experiment for our own curiosity to see if we could learn more about horses. So I'd bring Martin to my lab, and I'd do dissections for him. In fact, since he was at the hospital visiting me, I said, and nobody was in the MRI, I actually stuck him in there and took pictures of his brain, but I'm under strict confidence not to show those to anybody. But really what happened was, you know, we emailed back and forth, and then it became obsessive, where we just looked at all kinds of things with horses. And Martin said, we can't keep this a secret any longer. We really need to write a book. So evidence-based horsemanship really is the cowboy and the scientist putting the empirical data and the scientific support behind it. And that's how we created our book.
You also created a DVD with Mark Rashid. And
I did. And in fact, I'm collaborating a lot with Mark Rashid, and some with Jim Masterson. Actually, the Jim Masterson story is a little interesting, and then I'll get back to Mark. But I don't really present at big, giant fairs, etc. That's not really the venue. And most people are really interested. It's more, as you saw, a classroom setting. But I got invited to this thing called the Equine Affair. And it's a big deal. I think they do one in the Midwest and one on the East Coast. And I was sharing a cab with a fella driving to the equine affair. So they were setting up transportation for us from our hotel to the event. And I'm sharing a cab with this guy, and I said, "Hey, what do you do?" And he said, "Oh, my name's Jim Masterson. I came up with this Masterson thing, this method." And I said, "You got a book on you?" He said, "Yeah." So he gave me a book, and he asked me, "What do you do?" So we swapped books. And then he contacted me, and we started talking about, he said, "A lot of things that happen in my body work I can't really explain, but I know something neurological is taking place." I said, "Of course it is. Everything your horse perceives is or experiences is something that impacts its brain functioning." So it turned out that Jim, I, and Mark Rashid got together and decided to do a clinic, and it went over so well that we did a second clinic, and we had a film crew come in and film that and create a DVD. And that's called Your Horse's Brain, a User's Manual. Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, this year, Mark Rashid and I have been collaborating. We're going to be doing some advanced horsemanship, horse brain behavior clinics where I'll do classroom teaching in the morning, and then Mark and I will go out, as you filmed,
Right.
in the round pen, and we'll work with horses and describe what's going on in their nervous system, so people have a window and a perspective of what they might be seeing.
I think I'm going to try to attend one of those too, if I can, during this busy year of rolling out this film and finishing it. But yeah.
Well, we'll save you a seat in the front row. How's that?
Got it. And you also did a book, I believe, with Maddie Butcher, Brainhead.
Oh, Horsehead. Yeah, I worked with Maddie, and I had gotten these were a series of articles on some pretty cool things, like place cells in horses' brains that tell them where they're at in space, almost like their internal GPS system, or things like polyvagal theory, which has become popular. But a number of those types of topics are sort of broken down, so you can read them, without chronologically reading them. You can just look anywhere in the book. Yeah. So
well, that does bring me to the next thing I wanted to go through with you, are just different words and phrases. But first, I need to let the audience know, because we're on radio as well as YouTube, and people jump in and out of radio, but you are listening to the voice of Dr. Stephen Peters, a neuroscientist and author, and who has been studying horses' brains for a long time, human brains. And it's a fascinating look into the behaviors of horses and our interaction with them, and even how our energy affects our horses and our relationship with them. And he's doing clinics with Mark Rashid, as he was saying, and Jim Masterson. I'm Leanne Lindsay, your host today, a filmmaker, a voice and film producer, and also longtime host here at KGUA in Wallala. And we are on 88.3 FM. We are streaming around the world at kgua.org. And we are again on YouTube, and you can watch it anytime there. So, I call you Dr. Steve. So, going back to some of these phrases, you brought up one of them already, and that's the polyvagal theory. And also I wanted to discuss the Vaso Vagal, because that's something I want to understand and grasp better too.
Okay, Vaso Vagal is basically fainting. So that's a vasovagal response. It's what we would call a parasympathetic response, where your blood pressure and heart rate drops precipitously. This can also happen under stress, and it can happen to your horse as well. They can sort of check out and dissociate from you, and so they're just standing still, and you think, "Wow, they're doing fine. They're in park," but if it was sympathetic arousal, meaning if they were highly anxious and you pushed them to the limit, it's possible that they then sort of checked out. Or if you use that old, hopefully not a lot of people use that learned helplessness flooding type of training where your horse is just going to take it and like it.
I still see it happening. I see it happening when I watch people who go out to buy horses, and these horses have been so desensitized, over and over with everything imaginable. Sometimes it seems to me that these horses have a learned helplessness or they've checked out.
They check out. They're somewhere else. They need to be somewhere else because the world that they're exposed to is not a friendly world. They're those old dude ranch horses that walk, nose to tail. And if a tree falls, they're not going to move unless somebody tells them to move. So the life, they have a dead eye. They're really not alert. And what you'd want is the opposite. You'd want your horse to get so comfortable that instead of tune everything out, they're actually aware of everything around them. They're aware of that dog that ran through the pasture. They're aware of those other horses that just got off the trailer, but they don't have to react.
Right.
Right. And so that's a whole different way of working with the horse's brain and nervous system than flooding them.
I think more and more people seem to be wanting these days to learn how to create a better relationship with their horse instead of trying to get that performance out of them or the specific work that they want to have that horse do. It seems like we're opening our minds up to what are other ways to approach this. And that's where you come in.
Yeah.
And Mark Rashid and Jim Masterson and Warwick Schiller and the rest.
One of the ways we get in trouble in a couple of ways. One is pretty clearly when we think a horse has a human brain and we give the horse all kinds of attributes. And you may think, well, gosh, I'm actually giving my horse all these attributes, but it's not accurate. And it can cause confusion for your horse. And also, our language, we may want to stop and take a look at that. The horse world still uses that old ancient idea of respect and disrespect and calling a horse disrespectful. Well, that's actually an abstract concept. And your horse doesn't have that frontal lobe capacity to understand an abstract concept either. You've taught your horse to come into your space, or you've inadvertently done something to let your horse think that that's okay. And that's just that your horse doesn't have that boundary in place. And they like having a boundary and knowing where they're safe. But if we don't provide that, if we're hugging on our horse and we're in our horse's space, and I'm not saying you can't do that, but then to call your horse in and the next time that happens, somebody on the fence says, you let your horse walk right all over you. And so then you try to discipline the horse. That's a mixed message. One of the biggest things that creates the most sympathetic arousal, meaning the most anxiety in your horse, is not getting clear messages. And we have to take responsibility for that. Our horse is a horse. Every horse brain is different, just like every human brain is. That's why, methods have their fallibility, because you can't just A, B, C, D, E, every single horse that comes down the pike. Some are going to have a past experience that are going to be hyper aroused. Some are going to be hypo aroused. Some are going to be just fine. To take those three different examples and treat them the same is actually you're going to end up with some problems. That's problematic. So we want to give our horse a voice and a say-so, and that's what we call an internal locus of control. What do I mean by that? Well, I think the old timers, I think, guys like Ray Hunt would say, well, you want to set it up for your horse. You want to have your horse solving problems, right? You want to give your horse choices because that's going to grow your horse's brain and actually give your horse options, right? So you want a thinking horse that's interacting with you, that you're in communication with, so that you're in tune with. So you have every time you're with your horse, it's a conversation versus you will do this, you will do that, you will do this. You can make horses do about anything, you can make them do that. But if you saw what that did to their brains, it makes a very rigid neural network in their brain versus creating a whole forest of dendrites. So they have lots of options. I don't know how many times horses have gotten me out of trouble just because I've relied on them when we kind of get in a tough spot, and they have options. They can figure things out. So you are responsible for the horse you create. They are only a victim of their neurochemistry. So if you're changing their neurochemistry, even unwittingly, you're creating the connections in their brain. So you can either grow yourself a nice garden of dendrites, a forest of connections, or you can actually cause stress and whittle those down.
Yes, I've been learning from Mark's books about giving the horse a chance to absorb what it is that you have asked and respond. Give a pause and wait for that response. And that's what you're talking about in part there.
I'm so glad you brought that up because the literature now, the scientific literature, we actually call this a gap effect. That's what we would term dwell in the past. And basically, here's how this works. After your horse or you have learned something new and you got it, that's the time to take your break, not to try to do it again and yet again and yet again, because you start to drill and you get less and less dopamine. It's less and less rewarding. You're not really learning to learn. Actually, you're just going rotely through.
Right.
But when you've got it and your horse knows they've got it and you just back off, their head comes down, they start to lick and chew. And we now know that it's that point at which an area of the brain called the hippocampus in memory, it replays what you just did forward and backwards 10 to 20 times in just a short amount of time. So you're actually perfectly replaying what you taught 10 to 20 times more efficiently and faster if you back off. But we get so greedy. We want to be in charge and do that, and we don't let the brain do its work. Right. But we're finding with humans, if you really focus in on something, and because that level of attention is, limited. We can't pay attention really focused in for a long, long period of time. And we need a break. Right. And it's during that break, in fact, scientists are now calling this a non-sleep rest event, where you're not sleeping, but you just sit back. If I'm studying on the computer intently, at some point, if I just sit back and I look off into space, off at the clouds for a while, it allows, while that's going on, my brain is actually taking away all the weak synapses that get in the way, all the clutter, and creating better connections and replaying that all. We know when we put somebody in a functional MRI, that's a neuroimaging machine that's taking a picture of your brain in real time. If you're reading a book, Leanne, I can look at the screen and I can look at the monitor and I can see which areas of your brain you're using to read that book. Right? So what we know is if we have somebody do a task, even a motor task, they move their arm, they write something, then they just lie there. without interruption. That's important, without interruption. If they just lie there, the same areas of their brain will light up that lit up while they were doing the task. And even if their arm is at their side, the same area they used to use their arm will light up again. So we know you replay what you had done previously. Now, if I went up to the monitor and I tapped on it and said, "How you doing in there?" or slapped you on the leg, it goes away. So oftentimes we want to reward our horse. "That a boy!" right after something, and we slap them. Right? So we think that we're giving a reward when actually, if we want those connections to be more complete, the thing to do is, well, Martin says is, when I know my horse has had the information and gotten it, it's something new, and they might have been somewhat stressed, but now they're coming down and they're starting to process it. I pull out my cell phone, I start making all the calls I need to make. I leave that horse alone. And the research would support that. And if you do something, let's say a first saddling, and all goes well, it doesn't mean that day you got to jump up on your horse. You know, you can only mess that up when things have gone that well. You take the saddle off and you turn them loose, because at night, a whole lot of things occur. This chemical called acetylcholine will wire together those connections, and your neural, and anything that you can associate with that will pull those neural networks together and create a bigger, broader knowledge base. With sleep, there's another problem, is a lot of horses are sleep deprived, because there's a fella, Joe Bertone. He's a veterinarian. He's done some work looking on this. He kind of fell onto it and then said, well, look at these horses stumble, and some of them are falling asleep on their feet. Largely, they're horses that are isolated. So they're not with other horses. And we know, based on their nervous system, that isolation is one of the most stressful things you can do to a horse. So if you're putting them in a box stall and they have no access to any other horses, and they might only be able to lay down on their sternum, right? That's not the same as being totally supine. You get rapid eye movement sleep, REM sleep, by being all the way turned over on your side. And you'll notice out in pasture that some horses will get the job of being sentinel. So that horse stands at attention, so all the other horses can lay down, and they'll even take turns at it. So that horse feels comfortable enough, and may not, when they're isolated, feel comfortable enough. Might not have the room and might not feel comfortable enough to lay out. And so they may end up being chronically sleep deprived. What happens to humans when they're chronically sleep deprived? They really can't pay attention very well. Their attention span is shot. So if you've got a horse who's not giving you attention, the last thing in the world they need is punishment to make them more stressed. So I think this idea that we're going to punish them into a behavior really has to go by the wayside. If you think of humans, you'd lose your job. If I was a college professor and I took my belt off and whacked kids and, yelled at them and called them names, I'd be fired. Well, horses have a nervous system as well. And they're only victims of their own neurochemistry. So what we want to do is learn what that neurochemistry is, learn what that environment is, put our horses in that, and optimize their ability to learn.
I like a couple of things you said just then too, because first of all, horses do want to know, am I safe? They're prey animals, basically, and that's ingrained in them. So if they don't feel safe, they're not going to sleep, and they need to get that rest. Number two, when you talked about slapping the horse, I've often done that to say, yeah, you did that. That was great. But then I think I need to unlearn that and take a different approach. And then another thing way back in what you were talking about that I wanted you to expand on a little bit, and that is the licking and chewing part of what, when your horse does that, what that means.
Yeah. Old timers used to say they were chewing on knowledge, right? And they were, well, here's what happens is your horse, every horse is going to be different, has a window of what they can tolerate. And most of the learning, the big dopamine hits, the attention, you have to have some sympathetic arousal to pay attention. You know, otherwise you put your head down or you go graze. Same with humans, you know. But if you think, boy, I'm going to fail this test if I don't study, there's enough sympathetic arousal to motivate you to study. So you got to kind of be at that top level to get the right neurochemistry. Now, when you get sympathetically aroused, certain things happen in your chemistry. You get enough what's called norepinephrine, and that's okay. It sensitizes all your neurons and makes you alert, and makes you aware, and you can really learn when you're at that point. But it's sympathetically aroused. What happens when you're sympathetically aroused? Well, your eyes get a little wider. If you get too sympathetically aroused, your lips go shut. Your mouth goes dry. So look at those horses that are stressed. When their heads are up above the withers and their eyes are big and they're looking to try almost getting ready for that fight or flight, when their eyes get huge, their nostrils start to flare. What you'll notice is that mouth is clamped shut.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can't even get your finger in there, right? And their mouth goes dry. There's a cranial nerve, the glossal pharyngeal nerve. You don't have to know that fancy term. Number 9. Just know good old number 9. Number 9 is parasympathetic fibers. So we know you're not in the sympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic, rest and digest, runs down to the salivary glands. So when your horse is licking and chewing, that means that's a good indicator that they've gone from sympathetic. Now they've reset their nervous system, and they're licking and chewing when the salivary glands get reactivated. And that's actually a good spot for them to process through information. It means they're probably in a deeper rest state than when they were activated. And the same thing we're finding with humans is when you're highly, highly focused, now you actually need that non-sleep, deep rest kind of state to process information in. And that's showing us brains are more effective. So that licking and chewing, go for as much of it as you can. That's a really good sign, because what your horse is also learning to do, every time you do that and allow them to come back down, and every time you do that without chasing them up and putting a lot of pressure on and let them come back down, their window of tolerance increases, and they're able to tolerate more and more, and they're doing something called self-regulating. So they're taking care of their own nervous system, so you don't have to. So the more you allow them to do that, in fact, in Mark Rashid's last book, he's got a chapter in there where he talks about his horse Rocky. And what I told Mark was, you know, I watched, and a storm started to brew while we were doing a clinic. Then it blew all these tarps around. So we went inside the arena, but the arena was one of these plastic kind of arenas. So everything's flapping around, making noise. So Rocky's head would come up, and then it would go back down. He'd lick and chew, and then he'd rub. That's another. There are some anxiety reducing strategies your horse can use, like yawning, like rubbing its face against its forelimbs. So Rocky was doing all this stuff, and Mark's talking, and then the audience clapped, and Rocky's head came up, and then he went right back down. What you worry about is that horse that gets up there and can't come back down. They have no practice coming back down. So they get up there, they're hyper alert. Now the very next thing, it makes them even more hyper alert, and it starts to stack. That the stimuli start to stack. So sometimes a small thing can cause your horse to explode. But Rocky was doing like letting the air out of the balloon. He'd get up here, but he'd do it himself. And so Martinblack calls the horses that do that his special forces horses. He said, I can do anything with these horses. They'll take care of themselves, and I can just worry about the job I have to do. But that doesn't come automatically. The horse has to feel safe enough. I almost use the analogy of, if you wanted to learn to dive off the diving board, right? If I let you walk off to the edge, look over the edge, sit on the diving board, dangle your feet off the edge, eventually jump off, and then dive off, pretty soon it's just one good behavior after another. You might be a little sympathetically aroused, but after you do it, you feel, yes, great. And you just get better and better and better. How do you feel if some big kid's behind you going to push you off the diving board, right?
Yeah.
That's oftentimes what we do with a horse. And the horse will know when you start giving them time to reset. So they get there, you say, let's sit here a minute and let's just reset. And you get that licking and chewing. And the more you do it, the more that window of tolerance grows. And the more your horse is able to self-regulate themselves, which is a real gift that you can give your horse.
This is all fascinating, really fascinating to me, because on a similar track 22 years ago, after just a simple arthroscopic knee surgery, a neurological dystrophy was triggered in my body. And back then they were calling it reflex sympathetic dystrophy. And now they're calling it complex regional pain syndrome. And it's still very painful, but it's in that sympathetic nervous system, and it's regulating that nervous system to lower the chronic pain that is a reaction from that. And one of the things that was a very effective healing method for me was neuro feedback with the electrodes on the brain. And it was connected to a software program on his computer that you could see. It's kind of, I was thinking when you were talking about the fMRI and you're watching their brains as they're doing some activity. Well, this was watching my brain as it was giving me instructions on, say, it gave me a star that was sitting in the night sky, big one. And if I calmed my brain down by thinking and meditating, that star would begin to rotate, and then sparkles would come off when I was in a really deep meditative state or calm state. And when you do that, or the purpose of achieving that is to calm the nerves down, so it calms that pain down. So I've been dealing with this for a long time, just myself, and so I'm listening to you, and I can see so many correlations.
You are exactly right. One, you got internal locus control, because you feel helpless if you don't have any control over it. So it gives you some control. So even on a psychological level, that's helpful. But it's more than that. If you can control your brain chemistry, right, by either being in control or meditating or whatever, you stop sending signals down that certain pathway, or you create more neurochemicals that inhibit some of those pain signals.
Especially when there's something stressful that happens, or, some loud explosion or something, that it sparks that adrenaline, and that adrenaline can kick in that pain. And so I had to learn how to work with this so I could regulate. It's kind of automatic now. I've done it so many times, but that's what I have to deal with. So I'm thinking about these horses too, and they are sympathetically over aroused, and how to get them to achieve that rest state again.
Yeah, if you're hyper alert, that's what it means, hyper alert. If you're hyper alert and somebody touches your chair or your back, you get this exaggerated startle response. And some people are so stressed, they live their life up there, hyper aroused, and they think that's normal, where they've never really reached homeostasis and been able to come back down within their.
It's not easy for me either.
No, in this modern age, it's really difficult. And so you have to have self-awareness, and catch yourself. Am I overdoing it? Am I actually creating this? And for people to say, oh, it's all in your head, at least we've stopped saying that, because Yeah, it's all in your head. It's all in the brain.
Right.
There's some fascinating things. Somebody who has multiple sclerosis, if they're stressed, they'll get flare-ups. They will create flare-ups. If somebody has Parkinson's disease, they'll freeze and can't walk. But if I walk behind them and say, fire, they'll be able to run, right, momentarily. That doesn't mean that everything's working. That just means we just have to appreciate how much our cognitive awareness and our brain, our thinking is all intertwined in this whole thing.
This whole thing. If you just tuned in, you're listening to Dr. Stephen Peters. He is a neuroscientist and an author of evidence-based horsemanship and a DVD, Your Horse's Brain, a user's manual that he created with Mark Rashid and Jim Masterson. And I'm Leanne Lindsay, your host today. I'm a filmmaker, producer, and horsewoman, lifelong horsewoman. In fact, I trained my first horse at 11 years old by reading a bunch of books, probably that referenced Ray Hunt or Tom Dorrance or one of those folks, because that's the way I trained my horse. And then I'm here at KGUA in Wallala. We are on 88.3 FM along the Mendocino and Sonoma coasts. We are streaming online worldwide at kgua.org. Just click that listen live at the top of the page and a web app will pop up. And also we are on YouTube today, so you can watch the show anytime on KGUA's YouTube channel. And back to you, Dr. Steve. One of the other things that I have here to talk about is that I wanted to discuss with you is you mentioned norepinephrine, and that is related to the adrenaline, I believe. And then I wanted to talk about serotonin function, brain versus gut. Or am I mixing too many things together there?
We got a lot of stuff here, but that's all right. That's all right. So if your viewers have their notebook handy, these are some to write down, and we'll talk about them. We'll talk about their importance. Probably some that are going to make our horse and us most comfortable. And one neurochemical, and we call these neurotransmitters, and then you'll see them listed as neurohormones. You'll see them listed as hormones. They're the same. They can be the same, right? And they're not the same. One that's getting a lot of attention now is oxytocin. So oxytocin is a hormone that really got not much attention. And then researchers started to look at women and childbirth. And what they discovered is high oxytocin levels when they were breastfeeding, when they were holding their infants. And so naturally they thought, well, this is what's going on in women that helps them form a bond with their child. There's actually a neurochemical that plays that role. Where do horses have the highest level of oxytocin, which we now think of as a bonding or what we call a trust chemical? In the herd. If they're in the herd and they're in a pasture and they're all together, that's where they're most comfortable. That's where they're going to have the highest oxytocin levels. Can they experience increases in oxytocin with you? Yeah. Yeah. They know you're not a horse. Don't go out there and try to be a horse. But when they self-groom, or they what's called allo grooming, they actually groom one another. They'll kind of nibble at the withers. Right. So there's some research to indicate if you'll go out there and you'll scratch on their withers, that you can create some oxytocin. You find those itchy spots they can't get to, and you scratch on them. But we also have to bear in mind, well, gosh, we're calling them herd bound, but what happens when we're removing them from the herd? We want to take them for a ride. So we call them barn sour or herd bound. Really, what's going on is oxytocin withdrawal. So if you're going to withdraw the oxytocin, you got to be prepared to replace it with other neurochemicals. One of those can be dopamine. Dopamine is one of the most highly rewarding chemicals. There's no study out there ever done that doesn't at least indirectly indicate that dopamine plays a huge role. So we know dopamine is that neurochemical that will facilitate curiosity, right? So we've got oxytocin, it's our bonding neurochemical. We've got dopamine, which is our rewarding chemical. Serotonin, you mentioned. Serotonin is a neurochemical that is associated with emotional balance. In fact, what they've done before is they'll take pastured horses that are in a herd and then take horses that are in box stalls. And if they look at their blood plasma, they'll find much higher levels of what's called 5-HT. That's the precursor of serotonin in those pastured horses that are together, that aren't stressed and isolated. So if it's an emotional balance sort of chemical, those horses are probably feeling much better. In fact, it's no different with us. A big family of antidepressants, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, that's what Prozac is. Keep serotonin in your system longer to help you deal with depression. It's an emotional balancing chemical. Norepinephrine. Norepinephrine kind of has a bad name because it's been associated with fear, because it hypersensitizes neurons. Well, if we're hypersensitizing an area called the amygdala, which is related to fear in the horse's brain, right? If we're hypersensitizing that, if we're so sympathetically aroused, we're so scared, so full of norepinephrine, then we're not even going to be able to concentrate or think. But we need a little bit so we can pay attention.
Right.
And what we'd like to do is sensitize dopamine neurons, so then we get curious, and we're so curious we want to check things out, and we want to go out and explore, right? You can get your horses like that too. But knowing where, and the people always ask, how do I know if I've gone too far? Every horse is different. Sometimes you have to go too far to know you went too far. And then say, okay, I understand. I'm going to just back off. I'm going to let you reset. You haven't broken your horse. The only thing you could do worse is you get your horse sympathetically aroused, and then you get after your horse and try to make your horse do things, and now they're going higher and higher. Restraint is, besides isolation, restraint is super stressful to horses.
I'm learning more about this now too.
So when they get sympathetically aroused, so they have a certain amount of norepinephrine there, they're aroused. Okay, they may be able to learn right here, or maybe I need to let them reset. But that might be a good place for them to be. But if they're trying to check things out and I've got their lead line right under their chin and I'm restraining them and they can't get away and they start fighting me on it, then they get panicky. Oftentimes you'll ride by a big boulder and your horse might spook, right? And if you just let them trot away or move around in a little circle out away so they can get just far enough, like they would in a pasture if they got scared, just far enough so they know they're safe, they'll turn around and check it out.
Exactly.
And reset themselves and take a look at that. But if they spook and you try to hold them, and then you clamp your legs on like a clothespin and don't realize you're doing that, and you're pulling on the rein, they're saying, there's a monster here, and you're scared too because you're clamping on. Now you got two nervous systems filled with norepinephrine, and that's oftentimes where you have problems. That horse goes to bucking, it bolts to get the heck out of there because we haven't allowed them to reset. So that's our norepinephrine. If you have norepinephrine in your system chronically, what'll happen is that will get sent down to the adrenal glands. It'll go hypothalamus to pituitary, down to adrenal glands. And in the literature, if your readers are really that nerdy, like I am, they'll see in the literature HPA axis, All that's talking about is an area called the hypothalamus. It's like a barometer of the nervous system. The pituitary gland, which will create chemicals, and those will go down to the adrenal glands, which will produce, and we, it's been called adrenaline, but that's really not the right name for it. Norepinephrine is a better name. But what those adrenals will do over time, if they keep pumping chemicals, those chemicals will be cortisol. And cortisol is the granddaddy of stress hormones. So you can have a horse that's chronically stressed. It'll impact their immune system. They may look okay, but that chronic stress is a horse filled with cortisol. So, wow, that's pretty good. In your talk, we've covered quite a gamut of neurotransmitters and what they do.
I know, we're right at the top of the hour now. So we've got just a couple more minutes. And one thing I did want to say too, that it really helps with horses as well as with people with ADHD or autism to be consistent. Consistency is so important when you're working. And I'm learning this too, to try to be more consistent, because my daily life may be a little hectic, but I've got to remember, when it comes to my horse, to be as consistent as possible, to show up, to do things as I've done before. That plus I really wanted to address heart rate variability, because one of our other experts in the film I'm working on is Ellen K. Gerke, and she had done some studies with the Heart Math Institute. And I know you have a lot of experience with that as well. Maybe we'll have to have you back to talk about those things.
But basically what Leanne's talking about, heart rate variability, we're not talking about heart rate. We're talking about the variation in heart rate.
Yes.
And really, we don't mind if our horse's heart rate increases. What we're concerned with is how fast they can come down. So what we've been talking about all along, resetting the nervous system, is this same ability, heart rate variability, where the horse gets so used to that variability, their range of the emotions that they can tolerate grows. So their window of tolerance grows significantly. You put the horse in the back of the trailer and they get stressed, their heart rate might be sky high. But if in 2 minutes, they're just all calmed down and back to normal, that heart rate variability is something we'd like to see, to be able to restore that quickly. If the horse is here and now trigger stacked, without any variability, it's just very rigid, then that horse stands to potentially, with that kind of nervous system, become one of those horses that gets chronically stressed. Heart rate variability is just another tool that we can use to monitor that. And you're right. That's a deep dive. We could go on any of these topics. We could just go all day long.
Maybe we will. And the other thing is heart rate variability with some of the students who are in equine assisted therapy. Monitoring their heart rate helps to understand their reaction to what they're participating in. And another expert we have is Robin Gabriels from Denver, and she has been studying autism for a long time, and this is something that she's looking into, the effect of equine assisted therapy with autistic children. So we are now at the end, and this has been KGUA in Wallala. Dr. Stephen Peters from Colorado, a longtime horseman and not retired, but a neuroscientist and author of Evidence-Based Horsemanship, along with co-author Martinblack, and Your Horse's Brain, a User's Manual, a DVD with Mark Rashid and Jim Masterson. Thanks for joining us today on KGUA.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. I really enjoyed our chat.
Yes, I did too. Thanks again. We have another show coming in right on top of this one, Dr. Steve, but it's great talking to you again, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Same to you. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye. I'm Leanne Lindsay. Thanks for joining us today on KGUA in Wallala 88.3 FM. Up next, it's Native America Calling from our friends in Albuquerque, New Mexico.